So, in medical training can be rather grueling and very difficult at times. So, when I was a third year medical student, there was a very, for a lot of us, a very difficult part of medical training is internal medicine, where all of your book knowledge is put to the test. And so, I was, I was also like the student in the story, got top of my class in high school, but once you go to Stanford Medical School, there's not many top people. So I did okay, but internal medicine was really hard. And so as I started to, frankly, fail to translate what I'd learned in my test scores to applying it to real patients, I started to get more and more anxious. My hands started to tremble. I had maybe not the most supportive supervisor at that time. My attending physician noticed that and pointed it out, and of course that did not help. And so the next time I had to give a presentation, it was even more shaky and even more. And so this sort of like started to spiral, and for the first time in my professional life, it was really a question of not just am I going to be able to get the A or the A plus, but am I even going to pass? Like, I made it this far. I've got now hundreds of dollars of medical school debt, and was I even going to be able to pass? And that was a very shocking moment. But more than that, like I defined myself as I'm a doctor. I'm going to be a doctor. That's who I am. And what if I couldn't pass this rotation? Then I'm not a doctor anymore. And so it started to hit me that the reason my hand was shaking wasn't that, I was nervous about not getting a good evaluation, but that I'd wrapped my identity up in becoming a doctor, that I'd put my personal value so high in this profession, in this job, that it was really an existential threat if I didn't pass, if I didn't give a good presentation. And so I became very, terrified. And over the course of very accelerated several weeks, really had to come to terms with, how do I overcome this? And realizing, my value isn't in whether or not I have this, very, well thought of profession or not. My value is in, as a Christian, that I'm a child of God, that I'm loved regardless of whether or not I'm successful at this career, whether or not I really did slip through the cracks and get to this point in my career without having the resources to pass. And so I studied more, I got some more resources, and was able to struggle through that rotation. Now, I did much better in my psychiatry rotation, I'll assure you. But it was a moment of imposter syndrome. Had I really gotten this far by mistake? Had somebody made an error in admitting me to Stanford Medical School? And so this topic hits close to home. So formally, it's been studied and described in this way. I think there's been one decent, and I say decent with it wasn't the best paper, but there's not much formal research on imposter syndrome, and that's significant by itself. But high-achieving individuals who, despite their objective success, fail to internalize their accomplishments and have persistent self-doubt and fear of being exposed as a fraud or imposter. This is sort of the research working definition of imposter syndrome. There have been first described in 1978. There have been 62 studies. And again, I'd love to see an actual meta-analysis on this, but it does look like maybe approximately half of the studies have found a gender effect, women more than men. About half found that it's worse for younger people than older people. And it's definitely worse with suicidal ideation history or suicide attempts or major depression. So in terms of formal research, that's about the limit of knowledge, but it is a metaphor more broadly for, I think, a certain kind of distress that people experience. This is one of my favorite things to do, and there's actual scholars in this room that can do this analysis formally, but Google Ngrams is an approximation of the entirety of the written English language and what percentage of the English language is made up by the word imposter syndrome. And so there's been from 1985 to 1990, 1995, rather dramatic growth. But you get to 2000 and you gotta rescale. It continues to grow. 2005, we got to rescale again. 2010, oh my gosh, we're out of control. 2015 and 2019. So if you plot this on a logarithmic scale, we're by about 2100, the entirety of the English language will be the word imposter syndrome. So, we've limited resources all around. The word imposter syndrome is running out. But nonetheless, all jokes aside, it's an increasingly, exponentially more commonly used phrase to express a particular kind of distress. But why now? Like, why is this growing exponentially? And I think that part of it is just like we're finding new words and the same amount of distress is shifting to different descriptions. But I do think there's some things that make me think that some things really are worse. And as a psychiatrist who sees patients, there's a lot of suffering and a lot of distress. And I really do think that it is worse now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. This is Robert Putnam, classic study on loneliness. We're actually lonelier than we were on both objective and subjective measures. So in 1985, the typical American had 3 confidants. That is, if you ask somebody in a survey, could you name somebody you could talk to about important matters? Like, that's the limit of confidant. They can name 3 people. That's the typical response. And by, I think it was 2003, it had dropped to 1. So absolute enormous drop in confidence. And that's like the typical American, with one single person in the world they could talk to about important things. That's bad. So more phones and less church. These are 2 other trends. So roughly 2009, after decades, ever since they've been keeping track of this, of stable participation in this both social and spiritual activity, there's been a drop in religious service attendance. Of course, it's a U.S. study, so most of that effect is Christian. Yeah, more phones. So this is a cathedral that has rented space to Samsung for advertising purposes. But I mean, I think that, again, the symbolism of that is just so deep. But yeah, we're spending a lot more time on our phones, and the social media that is connected to that is ever present. So here are numbers of, these are 12th graders starting around 2009 again. You just start to see these increases, perhaps sooner for people who identify as liberal and conservative, but it's kind of across the board, getting worse and worse and worse with no end in sight. In academia, it might actually be harder. So, if you just say, hey, well, my supervisor and his supervisor, why can't I do what he did? And well, the answer might be because the number of government dollars going to research has dropped by 4-fold on a per PhD or 5+ year of college. The census only has 5+ years. They didn't do PhDs back in 1960, I found out. But yeah, huge drop in actual funding per person who has these kinds of degrees. And also the total number of jobs per person with these degrees is also down by like 4-fold. So it's actually harder. And then like science might be getting more complicated. So the number of people that collaborate on papers has been growing exponentially over the past years. So like, those are all hard things by themselves. And so like the idea that the heuristic, maybe I should just compare myself to my supervisor or their supervisor, might not work or might make it hard. Quick things to do about it. I mean, all these are, careers in themselves. But one is just to be mentally healthy and take physical action to improve mental health. That sometimes it's bad mental health that's driving the psychology, bad physical health that's driving the psychology of imposter syndrome. I mean, there's plenty of patients that, good eating, good exercise, and good sleep, and that's all they needed. But also confession. For imposter syndrome, the implication is that there's a deception that's involved. That somebody has that I've deceived the Stanford admissions committee. But if you talk about that, it's hard to, you can no longer be an imposter if you're confessing what the problem is. And so sharing that this is something that a lot of people struggle with. It's not rare. It relieves a lot of the stress. This is a great AA slogan. You're only as sick as your secrets. And we can get into these maybe in more detail. But trying to think quote unquote rationally about things. One of my mentors, Jeff Schwartz, likes to say, think about it from the perspective of a benevolent third party, somebody who knows you, cares about you, wants the best for you, and is not you. How would that person think about things? And so, motivation. Ask yourself, what is imposter syndrome, or what is this feeling? What is it doing? How is it? What does it say about me that's really good or beautiful? remember that it's axiomatically false. I got this from one of my colleagues, Owen Muir. If you are the person who's asking the question, am I an imposter? You are not an imposter. Imposters don't ask themselves, am I an imposter? They're just lying to people. They know they're lying to people. But it's that there are, but also trying to think about questions of applying the standards you'd apply to yourself. If you think, well, if I had a friend, would that work? No, like you're judging yourself unfairly, and that's why it's painful. And then also considering the truth, some objective truth or reality of your self-evaluation. And then finally, seek. And I think asking the question, is there something that is grounding or that would allow you to have significance regardless of professional success? So this is a study that I was helped in the design phase. When you do the, when you ask people, you interrupt people randomly throughout the day with various questions of their momentary states. People who had daily spiritual experiences at a high level, when something bad happens, it doesn't make the day worse. It doesn't make their sense of meaning, purpose, significance any worse. It makes it better. So there are states of spirit, and this is also whether you're theist or not, feeling connected, feeling like you are loved and cared about. When you have those things at a high level, it almost doesn't matter what happens in the world. In fact, the worse things happen in the world, the better you feel about things, which is one of these incredible paradoxes, incredible findings. And so seeking a sense of that connectedness or that significance or that identity that's resilient to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune.